Welcome to After the Fact. For the Pew Charitable Trusts, I'm Dan LeDuc. We're continuing our coverage of a special event to commemorate Pew's 75th anniversary that's focused on strengthening democracy in America. It's a conversation between filmmaker Ken Burns, the president of the Pew Research Center, Michael Dimock, and Beverly Kirk, who directs Washington programs for Syracuse University and serves as a professor at the S.I. Newhouse School of Public Communications. We begin with Professor Kirk.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to today's event commemorating Pew's 75th anniversary. And we are continuing our discussion this morning about strengthening democracy with a look at trust in institutions, trust in each other, and what the latest data have to say about all of this. To put it into perspective, I am joined by filmmaker Ken Burns and Pew Research Center President Mike Dimock. Thanks so much for being here, and let's jump right in with the first question. So, what is the overall state of American confidence in democracy? I understand you have some new numbers to share with us.
Yeah, thank you, Beverly. We don't want to get too gloomy, but we do care about the facts. And the facts are right now that America is in a kind of gloomy place. I think in a way, almost surprisingly. If you had told me 2 years ago we'd be worried about an economy that was too hot, which wasn't really even a phrasing we were talking about, that we'd be where we are with our COVID rates, not necessarily done, but feeling a little bit better, that we would have passed major pieces of legislation addressing climate, addressing all sorts of issues, global competitiveness, that we would have had a midterm election that went pretty smoothly and wasn't really contested. And I might have told you then, wow, we'd be feeling really good as a country, right? We had some rough patches and we're feeling all right, but we're not really. The poll we put out this morning shows America in a pretty gloomy spot. 19% satisfied with the state of the nation. That's pretty low. But we were asking, too, about people's outlook and people's looking back. And the outlook is very gloomy. We have fewer people confident in the future of our country than we've seen in previous polling over the last decade or so, even during the pandemic and before. And we asked some really specific questions about think about America in 2050. What do you think the country will be like? And really across the board, the outlook was pretty gloomy. We asked about, do you think our economy will be stronger or weaker? By about 2 to 1 weaker. Do you think the U.S. will be more or less important in the world? By almost 3 to 1, less important in the world. We asked about whether we'll be more politically divided. 77% think that what we're feeling today is only going to intensify over the next 25 years or so. So across a lot of fronts, this kind of really sense of a dour outlook. And then putting it in a historical context, we said, well, thinking back 50 years ago, do you think we're better today or worse than we were 50 years ago? And today we're seeing Americans say about 2 to 1 worse. And we haven't seen that before in our polling. Usually there's a split. There are people who pine and have a nostalgic view of the past. But to see it really tip in that direction is quite striking.
Ken, let me bring you in to ask, why do you think we're feeling this way?
You know, it's a combination of factors, Beverly. Even when we don't have ones and zeros around us, we seem to think of the world in a kind of binary construct, and nothing is binary. And so interesting that 50 years ago would put us in 1973, Michael, right?
Yeah.
When we were still trying to disentangle from Vietnam. There was a lot of things going on. I always find it so interesting when I do the anecdotal informal polls of audiences that I speak to. People, are happy in a particular period, and then you point out what was going on. I've been told many times that they like to be back in the 30s or the 40s when it was simpler times. And I said, when there was the greatest economic dislocation in the history of the world, followed by the greatest cataclysm in the history of the world, responsible for the deaths of, we think, 60 million people. And people stop and they go, oh, yeah. So I think in some ways, just as someone who studies this in anecdotal fashion and in narrative fashion, that the narrative that is presented to us today is one that's accumulated imperceptibly. And because we're in siloed where we get our information, it's not really about the facts that Michael cares so dearly about, as do I. It's the fact that if you keep hearing the same thing over and over again from your source, you begin to believe it. And that narrative is not necessarily in sync with what people's experiences are. I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish, and at the same time, I don't want to feel like I'm Chicken Little either, that the sky is falling. These are incredibly fraught times, and I think how people are responding to it is as much, as Marshall McLuhan said, because the medium is the message, about how they're getting their information and how the negative viewpoints are being reinforced and reinforced. But as somebody who's an amateur historian involved in telling stories about history, I'm always so surprised because you realize you've seen it all before, that there are places where the fever of disappointment or disillusionment breaks, and then all of a sudden, tomorrow, you're in some new era of good feeling.
If I could jump back to the facts, it is a gloomy outlook, but is it by a divide? Is it because we are so polarized? And in parts of the country where the economy perhaps hasn't rebounded as much as it has here in the Washington area and along the East Coast and on the West Coast, where people are maybe feeling a little bit more tense and a little more stressful. Yeah. How does that divide figure into the numbers that you just told us about?
Yeah, no, I think it's true. And one of those outlooks was whether our income divisions in the country would be bigger or smaller in 2050, and by 80+% say they think we're going to get even more separated economically as a country. But I think it also plays in Ken's comments too, we are in a notably polarized period in America politically. I don't need to tell you all of that. It shapes almost every civic conversation that we have today. But it's notable in two different dimensions when you really want to break it down and understand it. One, we find fewer divisions in our society that don't fall into a red versus blue kind of alignment, right? It used to be that you might find common cause with somebody on one issue, disagree with them on another issue. That seems to be less and less common in people's experiences today. Their experience is one of us versus an enemy within our own country. And then that leads to or cycles with the second dynamic of it, which is this deeply personal identity with partisan politics and this sort of extended, telescoped view of how bad the other side is in the political array. And that's accelerated to the point that we not only feel like this division is cleaving our country, but we start to lose confidence in our own fellow citizens and what their intent is and how informed they are and how effective they are as part of our democracy.
We've been a 51-49
Right.
split nation for a while here, and what you're talking about seems reflective of that. Is there any way to feel common ground?
For about 30 years now, since the mid-1990s, pretty much every American election, whether general or midterm, has been the balance of power, right? And that makes every election feel existential when you think the other side is not only disagrees with you on issues, but will actually damage the country if they can hold the levers of power. And that's been the mood, right? And it's continued to accelerate. And so that leads to this really hyper-competitiveness. And I think two particular things that we as citizens can be conscious of and communicators can be conscious of. It's the perception that everything's zero-sum in that environment. Any gain by the other side is intrinsically a loss by my side, which is truly not the way civic affairs happen in a society. And this sort of anxiety over slippery slopes. If we give an inch on this issue, we're going to lose everything, right? And that you can think about that applying to almost any issue debate that's going on, that there's no room for compromise, because giving even an inkling on this front is going to open the floodgates for the other side to control this issue.
And I want to bring Ken in to talk more about the sequence of divide, because it's not something that happened just recently. This has been building over several decades, correct?
Yeah, I think so. And we've seen it in other periods in our time. I think this has been building significantly since the Vietnam War, particularly, but there's earlier catalysts. You can see seeds of it in a post-World War II communist us versus them that Michael was talking about. When that disappeared, we turned it inward on ourselves. And I think this gets exaggerated, as he suggests, when we decide that no matter what happens, the great genius of our democratic process has been that, as George Will told me in a film, that democracy is the politics of the half loaf. You don't get everything that you want, that compromise is at the heart of that. And now we're at that uncompromising state that happens periodically. It certainly happened in the run-up to what we call our Civil War and in other moments in our country. And we feel that now, that there's no room, you can't compromise on this. This is the wrong thing to do. And you have the take no prisoners, zero-sum kind of attitudes that we see. And at the same time, we're looking at civic participation at levels that are just unbelievable. The last election, the midterm election, who's voting? So I think in some ways there might be a silver lining that you're looking for, Beverly, just in the fact that whatever anxiety people are feeling about this particular situation is that it's manifesting in a little bit more than just passive pulling out. I'll just go back to the us versus them. I realized recently that I have been working for nearly 50 years making films about the U.S., but I've also been making films about us. That is to say, the lowercase two-letter plural pronoun, all of the intimacy of us. And Jefferson says in the Declaration that all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. He's kind of acknowledging that this new thing, this republic, is going to take a lot of work and a lot of energy. And so I think that what we see right now is that existential threat that Michael mentioned, because we are in one of the great crises that we've experienced. We've turned on ourselves and we've made the other the enemy. And that's been an important, in the last 30 years, component of the increased stakes at hand. I made a film on jazz, and at one point, Wynton Marsalis said to me, sometimes a thing and the opposite of a thing are true at the same time. And I think that in a binary way of receiving data or in interpreting data in the way we respond politically in those silos of ours, we forget that's how life goes on. That's how we deal with everything. You can't be married or you can't have kids if you don't understand that sometimes the thing and the opposite of a thing can be true at the same time. And so I think our own lives are much more supple. Our own lives are much more forgiving and purposeful. And yet when we pull out and we think about things in political sense, that becomes the source of a lot of problems. It's my way or the highway. And then you really run into trouble because Jefferson's machine doesn't work unless there is compromise, unless there is a sense that in order to maintain this very new thing, we've actually got to work really hard. That's civic engagement. And civics is about as dirty a word as you can get today.
Civics is a good word, I think. At least we need to make it a good word again.
I'm talking to you from a tiny town in New Hampshire. And civics is how you get things done. That's politics, is how you get things done. We're debating whether to buy a fire truck or a pumper for the fire department. These are really serious things. They don't sound like it in the scope of our conversations, but we have to realize the way in which we are liberated in our ordinary lives from the tyrannies of these opinions. And my best example is that, in the midst of hurricanes and storms and natural disasters, it's very often people in their duck boats rescuing people who don't look like them. And if you think about it as an us, there's no them. And whenever anybody tells you there's a them, run away. Unfortunately, the dynamics of our politics today is continually making the other a them rather than understanding that it is all us and only us. There is only us. And I think that's part of the message that I'm trying to convey today.
You mentioned, Ken, if I could pull the string a little farther, that we might be in the middle of what you call a fourth crisis. The other three that you mentioned, the Civil War, the Great Depression, and World War II. Are we in a fourth crisis?
Oh, yeah, most definitely. And I don't want to try to, as I said, be kind of soft pedal the seriousness of this moment and to try to somehow not interpret the data that Michael is giving us without a kind of sense of urgency and even to some extent panic. But I think, yes, I believe that the movement and flirtation with anti-authoritarian, anti-democratic impulses combined with the pandemic, combined with the racial reckoning, again, the George Floyd's murder and the subsequent murder of many other Black and brown people throughout the country for no reason other than the color of their skin has provoked in us this kind of crisis that feels very much the same. And as I mentioned before, those other crises, except in sort of particular moments and areas, did not have with it the idea of free and fair elections being challenged or peaceful transfer of power. We had a national election in the middle of the Civil War, and the incumbent won, and he wasn't expected to, and nobody cried foul. And also the independence of the judiciary, I think, has added to a sense of pessimism. If you can't look for some umpire who's going to look at it and see that the guy is out at first, but calls it because he knows the runner, you get a little bit concerned about the whole structure of things. And so I think this is very much as existential as it gets in the United States. And so I think what the current data show is that we are at that place where we perceive that existential threat.
Is part of the problem that depending on where you live in this country, you may think of one set of facts or another set of facts, and Pew's all about the facts?
For sure. We often say at the Pew Research Center, even though we're in the business of generating data, people are not lacking for data these days. Everybody's coming at you with some kind of number, and they're usually using it to try to persuade you of something. And I think that's a part of it. People have become a little bit anxious that, is such a thing as a core fact or truth. And it becomes easy to gravitate towards the data points that confirm what you already believe or reinforce your team's direction of travel or make the other side look bad. So I think you're right. There's a cycle of that kind of questioning and doubting. And I think Ken's point about the Supreme Court or the court system is also a really interesting one. We've tracked views of the courts, and at the end of the day, it is the ultimate adjudicator, in the sense of that independence is essential. And there's been a lot going on that has led both sides to feel anxious about that, both the left and the right, seeing a court that they worry is a place that has a bias against them. And all of a sudden, then, that makes everybody's confidence in the system feel like it has no grounding.
Which leads to my next question, which is about trust in institutions, which Pew Research has found is eroding. And Ken, you've said that the trust began in the government began eroding back in the 60s. You've alluded to the Vietnam War, and it's continued. There was Watergate, and most recently the pandemic, and the questions surrounding whether information was trusted. So let's talk about the news media and the role it may or may not play in the erosion of trust and the fragility of institutions. Do you have data talking about the media and the government in respect to this?
Yeah, sure. People are very skeptical of the media, although you can go back and look through eras of American history and see a lot of skepticism about the motivations and ideologies that are embedded in media. So you do have to take a little bit of a pause on that front. I think what's notable in today's media environment is its fracturing relative to what we think of as historical today, which is a period in maybe the 50s and 60s of a relatively centralized, unified national media infrastructure that had developed a sense of professionalism that was defining what it meant to play that fourth estate role in the country. That was arguably an anomaly in the history of media in this country, to have it that centralized and that professionalized and that separated from ideology. But returning back potentially to that more politicized, more fragmented, more hyper-focused on particular issues and topics is destabilizing. People don't know what to believe. They may gravitate towards different sources. It's not that people distrust all information sources. Most of us can identify lists of sources that we trust, right? But they may be different than the sources that other people are trusting at any given time. So I would say it's a decentralization process, a kind of fragmentation process that feels deeply disruptive to us right now, because we were in a period where there was a kind of central media authority that was establishing a ground truth for a while.
And Ken, what would you say, looking historically at this? Because there was yellow journalism back in the 30s and 40s. The only thing that's different today is the technology that allows a lie to get around the world with the click of a mouse, rather than it taking more time for it to filter through. We're not really talking about something in terms of there being this information that's out there that may or may not be factual. It's always been the case. It's just the technology that allows it to proliferate so quickly, so fast, and be generated in so many different places.
Yes, and I think be manipulated. The yellow journalism of the late 19th century that helped propel us into the Spanish-American War and then other periods immediately afterwards in which muckrakers were using the platform of their newspapers and their magazines to advance social cause and progressive reform. You can go back to the Revolution. I'm working on a film on the history of the American Revolution. Sam Adams is just a really great guy at keeping grievances alive. Right? He just wants to make sure you know how bad things are and how bad Britain is. And you've got pamphleteers. The greatest one in the history of the United States is Thomas Paine. His common sense was just riveting. Here's a Brit who just despises monarchy, and has one of the great lines in history, which is, I still can't figure out why a continent should be ruled by an island. That made a lot of sense for people. But I think what happens is, we do not appreciate now, in our distance, just how bad the Depression was, what it took to get back on our feet and then prosecute the Second World War, and the systems, the bipartisan systems that effectuated that result. Together, you'll find periods where Republicans and Democrats are coming together to work on really important things, even with great dissension within each of the parties over things like civil rights. And I, again, don't wish to be Pollyannish. I just wish to say I think we can take a lot of this with a grain of salt. And what it requires is just what Jefferson was asking. Good grief, with all of his flaws and contradictions, he's proclaiming a few sentences earlier that all men are created equal, and he owns hundreds of human beings in his lifetime. Doesn't see the contradiction of the hypocrisy. And so we're hoisted on these petards all the time, not just our bold-faced political figures, but our own selves in this othering. And I think we owe it to ourselves that the vagueness of his words permit us to realize just how much social and civic engagement means. I think are the antidote to everything.
Sticking with media and the idea of information, I want to get both of your thoughts on misinformation and the role storytelling can play in helping to combat misinformation, because it seems as if there's a lot of information coming at everyone from a lot of different places. And I know that you have some data on that as well.
Yeah, people are rightly very anxious about misinformation, which arguably is a good sign. There's a lot of kind of skepticism out there. There's a lot of awareness that this environment that we're in is full of truths and mistruths, misrepresentations. So I think the question is, does that let you say, I'm not going to believe anything, or let you construct your truths, just sort of dispel the very idea of truths and facts out there? But I think the fact that as early as we are in the arc of modern information technology, right? Very early, right? Mm-hmm. How many years have we had iPhones? How many years have we been always on with Wi-Fi? It's not that much in the course of our ability as a species and as a culture to adapt to these changes. We're very front and center conscious of this stuff. And so I think that's one of those good signs, I think, that we are actively thinking about this. People do have some healthy skepticism about it. It doesn't mean that misinformation isn't out there and disruptive and believed by some. Mm-hmm. There probably isn't an era, and Ken could correct us, when misinformation wasn't a problem in our civic conversation at one level or another, whether it was around health or politics or anything. These things aren't entirely true. There's certainly a way that this modern technology opens up floodgates of opportunities for misinformation to travel faster and further. But I think you're already seeing ways where our consciousness of that are really front and center.
Ken?
Yeah, I agree. And I had meant to address before your comment, Beverly, and Mike has picked up on it, that the speed with which it goes around and gets out there is problematic. I'm all for the cures. One is, of course, to read, and to read a lot, and to look for mainstream sources of information, newspapers. Doesn't matter what your political inclination is. You can find a really great newspaper doing that. Do the same thing with, if you're getting your information from old-fashioned broadcast television, stray away from the extremes of cable and into something more mainstream, so that you can get a sense of that somebody else has a point of view and it's not the end of the world to hear that other point of view expressed. And then if it's online, mind to sort of gravitate to a variety of sources. These are very simple things to do, and they're republic saving. They really are. And find ways to engage the people who don't believe the way we do. Now, maybe you go home for Thanksgiving and there's Uncle so-and-so that you can't talk to, or he won't talk to you about this sort of stuff. But I live in a small town. We can't get by not talking to each other. So you're not find yourself down the rabbit hole that we find so many people, particularly people in moments of crisis who've done horrible things recently. Their relatives will say they went down this rabbit hole, and you end up with the kinds of horrible tragedies that we've experienced recently.
Let me ask both of you. We've established that no one trusts the media. And maybe the media has given them some reasons not to trust.
I would say the more broad and abstract things are, the more doubtful and mistrustful people are. And then the more concrete and immediate they are, the more confident they are. We just released some data earlier this year on how people look at government, and you say, oh yeah, trusting government, it's terrible, I can't trust the government to do anything. But when you ask people about almost every single agency of the federal government, top to bottom, more people say they're doing a good job than a bad job, right? The actual work of government is not what people are mistrustful of. They think there are capable people doing capable work. Is it always as efficient as it could be? Is it always as timely as it could be? Maybe not. But at the end of the day, people understand that's happening. So I think there's a way that it's really the broader politicized world of government that people are thinking about when they say they don't trust the government these days. And I think that carries through with other areas as well. So you ask about media. Yes, when you say the media, but what is that? That's a fiction that I can project my worst kind of impressions on. Most people do have sources that they trust, and the more local, the more close it gets, the more they trust it. The same in medical spaces. People trust their doctor. They may have doubts about the overall medical system. They're worried about the incentive structures. They're worried about the money. They're worried about other elements that might be introducing biases. And then, of course, what they're experiencing is costs and things that are making it hard for them to navigate medical information and get medical services. I think it's similar to what Ken's saying. The closer in, not necessarily just neighborhood closeness, but the more proximate things are to you, the more there are still avenues for trust, avenues for civic action that can be meaningful and rewarding, and therein lie the roots. Right?
Is that the hopeful note for democracy?
Right.
The overarching theme of our conversation today, and strengthening democracy, is that the hope, that it's at that local level and less about the national, more broader picture?
Yeah, I would say so to some extent. And I think, to me, technology is a big theme in all this, communications technology. And that has these dual capacities, right? On the one hand, the modern digital information technology can make everything feel more overwhelming. It can just feel everything's global, everything's mayhem. But at the same time, it's also deeply empowering for people to find their own communities, to find like-minded individuals, to realize that their life experiences are not just their own. There are other people in the world who share that. If you think about the way technology has empowered diversity in our country, it's incredible. And it's also empowered really important conversations in our country, many of which are difficult and painful, but important to happen. And technology has been creating new forms of community. And again, we're only in the earliest stages of this. But that is, even beyond just how many people voted in 2020, which I agree with Ken is a remarkable thing. 30 years ago, we were all wringing our hands over the fact that nobody was voting anymore. What's going to happen when nobody shows up for elections? Oh, we're not worried about that today. So careful what you're worried about. But I think the other way to think about civic activity is that more community level. And again, community can be physically local, but it can be in really important ways in other dimensions of community that are all new because of technology.
Can you share what you think is happening today that gives you hope, makes you feel hopeful?
My optimistic notes are around this idea that, as rightly concerned as we are about a lot of the ways these disruptions are dividing us, it really is also finding new community. I think there are so many examples of things that are happening because of technology, whether it's at an individual level and how we're connecting with others, whether it's around social movements. It feels trite now, but the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, those were online social movements, right? Yes. And they crystallized important civic conversations that were not happening, right, up until those people got together and used something to force a conversation in our society. Now, Did they fix everything? No, but we're talking, right, as a society about issues that we weren't before. That's a new form of social movement and social activism that, to me, is great. It's a signal that voices can be heard in new ways.
Ken, quickly, what makes you hopeful?
The novelist Richard Powers says the best arguments in the world won't change a single person's point of view. The only thing that can do that is a good story. Stories are elemental. Honey, how was your day? That's it. We begin to edit human experience. And so to me, the data is pessimistic in one way, and at the same time, it's always been like that. And so as an amateur historian, you begin to say, okay, I guess I can take a deep breath. And I think we do in fits and starts, a few steps back sometimes, but several steps ahead. We've gotten farther along. And I think having the stories to tell, the big stories, the historical stories, but also the intimate stories. How was your day, honey? Become the way in which we can actually metamorphosize a lot of this kind of junk, a lot of this stuff that feels like it's something, a pit in my stomach, and begin to just continue on.
What a wonderful conversation. Ken and Mike, thank you so much for your insights and your perspectives.
Thanks for listening. You can learn more about the guests featured in this episode and Pew's 75th anniversary by visiting pewtrust.org/celebratingpew75. That's also where you can hear our first conversation on strengthening democracy with Pew President Sue Uran and Librarian of Congress Carla Hayden. Meanwhile, here at After the Fact, we're working on our next season that will explore the ways Pew is using data to make a difference, support effective government performance, and help communities thrive. Make sure you're the first to hear new episodes by subscribing to our show wherever you listen to your podcasts. For the Pew Charitable Trust, I'm Dan LeDuc, and this is After the Fact.